Hi, this is Comptroller Brooke Learman, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street Podcast, the source for news and notes on Maryland policy and politics.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it is that time of the session where you and I go through the governor's proposed budget. We're going to do that today. Lots to get through, Michael. We're going to try and keep this under an hour. We always say that, but hopefully we can stick to it this time. But I know for you and me, this is one we always look forward to.
Kind of weird, isn't it? Glad to be back and doing it. And I kind of like this as an annual tradition that right around this time of year, late January, we do this whole breakdown. I had a number of years as sort of the keeper of the BRFA and the holder of the flame on the MACO team, and I've passed that torch to you. You wrote up a really good, piece by piece on the Conduit Street blog that I would advise our listeners to go dig into and read into. A lot of that covers county issues, but there's a lot of the bigger picture issues there too. But I enjoy this walkthrough because I feel like this stuff just sets the pace and tempo for the whole session, including non-fiscal issues. You just like when things are as tight as they are last year and this year, and probably will be again next year. It's a different Paul around town. So anyway, let's break down the budget, BRFA, and all that good stuff. We'll talk about the county issues, but some of the big picture stuff too.
Yeah, so we'll include links to our write-ups, and we do have some detailed write-ups on the blog. But top line numbers, the total all funds $70.8 billion, general fund $27.7 billion. Special funds, growth is largely driven by education and transportation. Federal funds obviously a big deal, flat to declining, and that reflects broader federal uncertainty. So total spending increases, but the general fund declines slightly from prior expectations. And this budget, it does balance, but it relies heavily on one-time actions, fund transfers, and bond swaps. So, I think, Michael, you always have an analysis here in terms of what that means in terms of are we cutting spending? Are people going to feel it? But those are some of the top lines. So spending increases, but the general fund declines, and the budget is balanced. But again, a lot of that is through one-time action, a lot of capital dollars shifting to general fund dollars, things like that. So no significant big cuts that I think people are going to feel, right?
There might be odds and ends here and there, but it's not like if we think of the magnitude of this year's problem as roughly $1.5 billion, that's kind of what we came into this session feeling like the problem in cash was about $1.5 billion. It's not like this plan is let's turn off spending, real spending on real projects or hiring people to deliver a service or building a building or the things that you actually spend cash money on outlays for stuff. There's a lot of spending limits and cuts in this plan, but a lot of them are things like the state's not going to put as much as it ordinarily would have to into its own rainy day fund to set aside money for a tough time. We're in the tough time, so let's not top off that fund as much as we would have. Okay, well, that's a reduction in spending in one manner of speaking. I'm not sure very many Maryland taxpayers would feel like, oh, that's reduced spending. I don't think there's a whole lot to hate in this budget plan as far as it goes. I think this will be less controversial than last year's proposals, but there's a fair number of things that are that sort of thing. You mentioned bond swaps. Is that worth like a 20-second explainer, maybe?
I think always.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what you can do sometimes like this is say, we've got a program where we do things like rural land conservation or program open space where we go out and buy plots of land to keep it from being developed. And typically, a lot of those programs are funded through the state transfer tax. They're in the budget as just cash. And in a year like this year, rather than spending $100 million to write checks for buying plots of land, the governor's proposing, how about if we bond for that? You can buy a plot of land with proceeds from a general obligation bond. So let's borrow the money, replace the cash, just keep the cash, let it fall to the bottom of the budget. So, I mean, that's a budget solution that's kind of borrowing for a while instead of paying in cash up front. So these are programs that are going to be made whole, but just with a different source of funding, and there'll be a long-term payment rather than short-term. So, we have folks in the local park and rec departments who really care about program open space. They hear, oh, we're not gonna have the transfer tax money that's going to be transferred to the general fund. Oh no! Now it turns out we're making you whole. You'll get bond proceeds, and with a few tiny exceptions, you can basically swap that out dollar for dollar. So you do that stuff in lean years like this, it's not a shocker. And I know that was more than 20 seconds.
No, I think that works. And look, I think this, we opened up this budget cycle with built-in pressure from prior year obligations. But really, I think also if you look at the deficiency spending, it really masks how little flexibility actually exists going forward. And we know that a lot of this all of it depends heavily on assumptions holding, right, and not new capacity. So when you look at what's going on with the federal government, and we know how tied we are to what happens in DC, and we're seeing that play out each and every day. It's important to note too that this is the governor's budget. This is based on assumptions right now, and a lot of things can change. But again, I think that Maryland obviously is in a tight spot when it comes to any kind of flexibility, and that certainly holds true now and moving forward.
Yeah, I think one more thing that you mentioned that's worth like a minor double click here is that I think we heard the legislative analysts earlier this week say that the bottom line for the general fund, I think that's the easiest number to track if you're trying to follow the bouncing ball and say what happens. Like the total federal budget includes a lot of pass-through dollars and other things. So I think the general fund is down very slightly from 26 to 20 as proposed for 27.
Right.
But there's some weirdness there because the FY26 budget is kind of artificially increased because they had some deficiencies in 25.
Right.
So what they mean is in the FY25, the calendar year 25 ended months ago, and on the books there were some expenses that had not been fully accounted for. So you had to spend some money in the current year, the FY26 budget, to basically, write the books for 25. So that counts as 26 spending, but that was always envisioned as kind of one time. So, I mean, it's not like each agency was told, come back with 97 cents on the dollar or something along those lines. So anyway, I think on balance, this is about the budget plan that I think we had been expecting. Relatively austere. There's not a whole lot of new initiatives or new directions or new spending, spending priorities and so forth. It's mostly stay the course, cover things over where you can, treat it like it's raining a little bit for the rainy day fund.
Right.
All that sort of stuff fits.
Yeah, and there are some enhancements, as you mentioned, not a lot of new spending, but it does have $269 million in discretionary enhancements that were not assumed in the prior DLS forecast. Nearly half of that is tied to economic development or business attraction. We know that that's a big issue and it's getting a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But those enhancements coexist with cost shifts, Michael, and not instead of them, right? So we see enhancements, but we also are facing some cost shifts, and I know we can get into that as well.
Right. And $169 million in most contexts is an awful lot of money. But remember, this is a general fund budget proposed at $27.7 billion.
Right.
So a 1% move in the state budget is like 280, and we're talking about 170. So, this is 0.2% or thereabouts. I mean, it's not nothing, and the General Assembly will have to sort of, get their hands dirty and decide what they can support and so forth. But it's not like this is not an ambitious, we really need to do these new big things. It's sort of targeted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yes, it's targeted, but just wanted to give some credit there in terms of, again, trying to put money in for, business retention, attraction, and get the economy rolling. And there's a lot of talk about less reliance on the federal government and to get more private sector investment. But again, those enhancements do exist with cost shifts. And before we get into that, Michael, let's talk taxes. Nothing massive in here regarding personal income tax or corporate income tax. We saw in last year's budget proposal significant proposed changes to the income tax here in Maryland, but nothing this year. There are a few things that have to do with the OBBB, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, if that's people want to call it that. And but those are mostly technical. There's real money involved with some of this stuff, whether you decide to decouple from some of those provisions, but no changes for the average Marylander in terms of, income tax rates or brackets or corporate income tax changes. None of that is in the governor's proposed budget.
Right. And the idea of us at the state level needing to sometimes course correct when the federal government makes tax policy changes, this isn't new for Maryland. Like most states, if you've ever filled out your own tax forms by hand, you know that an awful lot of things on your state return, they basically say, take the number from this line on your federal return and enter it here. So we pick up an awful lot of tax policy from the federal level and pick it up as the basis for state taxation. And when the feds do something that we philosophically don't agree with, we will frequently modify the state law to say, we're not going to allow that particular change, or we're going to double that amount, or we're going to ignore that federal thing. And so we're doing a little bit of that here, but it's not like this is an unheard of thing. I've lost count of the number of times that Maryland has had to make an adjustment to what carries over from the Fed. So this isn't a brand new idea. Hey, can I plant one more little nerdy flag here as we about to get into county stuff?
Of course.
I would just say, like, as a veteran observer, there's one thing you're always interested in hearing from the legislative staff. So the budget that's been proposed right now is from the governor, from the executive branch. It's now in the hands of the legislature for them to hold their hearings and do their analyses and make their own changes to the bill and to language and all that kind of stuff. That'll play out over the next 7-8 weeks or so. But there's always one interesting question, and that is, the Spending Affordability Committee, mostly legislators, and it's kind of a legislative-driven process. Every year they have limits for spending and for stuff like that in the governor's budget. And it's always an important question. Does the legislature think that the governor's bill, as proposed, passes those tests? Last year, the answer was no. So they had some extra work to do to get a plan that passed their own spending affordability test. This year, the answer is yes. He's made enough movement on overall spending and on the structural deficit and so forth that they've come to the table and said, this already passes the test for spending affordability. That is like, I don't know, dousing the ring on fire for the dog to jump through at the circus. It's not going to be on fire this year. And it makes this year's budget deliberations just one click easier and more straightforward because they don't need to find 94 million or 200 million or something like that. They're already there.
Right. So in fact, the Spending Affordability Committee wanted the fiscal 27 structural deficit to get to 600 million, to reduce it to 600 million. The governor's budget puts it at 394 million. So it certainly meets that expectation, as you said, although DLS had forecasted by 2031 our structural budget deficit to be 3.5 billion. Under the governor's plan, that goes to 4.1 billion. So it does meet the spending affordability goal of reducing the fiscal 27 structural deficit to 600 million. But in the out years, the plan does increase the projection for a structural deficit, especially when you get to, fiscal 29, 30, and 31. So again, meets it for now, but it does increase it in the out years.
Right.
Okay, so let's get in, Michael, to the BRFA, and, this is the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, and this is a bill that accompanies the governor's budget. And this is where we see action as county governments. This is where you change spending formulas, you cap formulas, you do things to make the budget work, right?
We typically find most things that affect local governments. Most of those things are written into state law in some sort of formula or directive or mandate or something along those lines. And so you can't change statute in the budget bill. The budget is special under the Maryland Constitution. There's all sorts of limits and that sort of stuff. But the central thing is that's just a one-year spending plan. If you want to change the law or give an exception to general rules, you have to have a piece of legislation. That's the budget reconciliation bill that rides along with the budget and does all the nip and tuck dirty work to make the whole plan balance.
Right. So, and what we see in this year's BRFA, again, I don't think a lot of this was unexpected. I think everybody knew it was going to be pretty tough, although there are some unexpected provisions in the governor's budget plan in the BRFA. So, Michael, let's start walking through those a bit. The top line, I'll say, between, last year's approved budget and this year's governor's budget, as proposed, counties are looking at about $200 million in cost shifts to help balance the state's books. So I'll leave the top line number there, Michael, and then let's start to get in because once again, the quote unquote county invoice saves the day here in helping the state balance its books.
Right. I mean, I think you put it the right way that this was fairly predictable, but we're seeing another installment of the story that kind of got started in earnest last legislative session. They had a crisis last year to the tune of $3 billion or thereabouts, threw a bunch of things against the wall, but a couple of things landed on county governments directly. One is the state saw a spike in their contributions to teacher pensions, which has been a state responsibility forever. And what they basically did was they concluded we're going to invoice counties for half of this extra teacher pension cost. They did it for K through 12 teachers, and they also did it for community colleges, which was new last year. That totaled more than $90 million. Back in the fall, we saw the state pension system do their arithmetic again. They say, hey, our costs are going up again around $80 million. And that's when you and I sort of scratched our chins and said, that sounds like the state will continue that policy and ship another invoice to the county to the tune of another $40 million, like half of that bump. And that's exactly what's in the reconciliation bill. This year with an added twist that they included the public library employees and their pension costs. I'm not sure why they weren't in last year, but are in this year. I'm sure there's a novel explanation there that we'll hear at some point, but I think that totals almost $40 million. That just is going to be the counties when they do their budget this year. They're going to have a number like we have to pay this to the state no matter what, and we don't get anything local for it. The state's just going to continue to give their state these employees the pensions they deserve, but now the counties are going to newly pay for it. So that's the first piece on that. That number grows, and I'm not shocked by it. We saw another twist, and it's along similar lines. Keep the function, but bill the counties. Mm-hmm. This is with some health services under the banner of assisted outpatient treatment. We've had sort of a policy back and forth about AOT for a number of years. The state really didn't provide the proper guidance and support for counties to adopt these programs locally. So there's been some frustrating policy back and forth about these services in the counties in recent years. And the solution in the budget reconciliation bill is if counties don't launch their own local programs that they pay for, then the state's going to launch a program in their county, and then the state's going to invoice the county for an increasing share of that program until it's 100% county funded.
Huge shift. And if I can add something there, I think this is where Kevin Kinnally says, shouldn't that be a standalone bill? Aren't we now prescribing policy? And it seems like shifting in the direction of this is something that should be a standalone bill. This sounds like a lot of policy. And I mean, Michael, I defer to you, but I know that this conversation pops up of like, what should be included in the BRFA? Should you be doing long-term changes in the BRFA? Should you be, capping, formulas for multiple years, or should you be doing something like this, which says this is definitely a big policy change. It's also a fiscal component to it, but obviously, again, this conversation is going to come up. Is this one that you feel like we should be at the table on a standalone bill?
So I don't know. I guess the easy answer for us as stakeholders, like every year where the budget is messy enough to require a budget reconciliation bill, we end up being we're on the menu, right? So there's some county program, or usually multiple, where we're suffering a cost shift or a cut or being flat funded or capped or whatever. So the easy answer for us is no, they should do this bit by bit. They should make 1 year changes in the BRFA just on the dollars and have the policy decision in the appropriate policy committee. Like we should be talking about, these public health services in the health committee, not in the appropriations committee over in the House of Delegates. I feel comfortable saying that just vaguely and generally, but over the years, for the most part, the Attorney General has ruled that measures like these that are about dollars they're not unconstitutional, even if they might be maybe practically unsavory for stakeholders like us. So I doubt it's going to ever end. We can grieve, but this probably is just going to continue and we have to suck it up.
Yeah, and on this one, it's again, you can understand a cost shift for an existing program or capping a program at a certain amount, but this comes out of left field in some ways in terms of this is how we're going to do this, and we're going to do it in the BRFA. Here's the solution that we've come up with. Just seems like this one was a little bit more significant than other things that we've seen. Yeah. But certainly, I understand what you're saying. But this is again, this is something that we see at all levels of government, right? This is stuff that Congress did to states, and everybody was up in arms about it. And now we're seeing the same thing happen from the state to the counties. Oh,
completely agree with that. All manner of state leaders in Maryland complained back in July when the Congress passed their big bill, and it included all these different cost shifts to states. And they scream correctly, I think, that this is irresponsible budgeting. To just send the federal problem down to the states is totally the wrong thing to do. But here we are with the state plan for a second straight year saying we're gonna balance our books by making the county budgets tougher. We don't like it. Our county leaders don't like it. It's low hanging fruit, right? I get it.
Yeah, and it is, but again, it is what it is, but it is something that happens. And depending on the stakeholders, depends on who's complaining, right? So we also see, though, in the governor's budget, disparity grants are capped for 3 years. Pretty odd to do it for so long, Michael. And we've talked about this. I think we did a Fluky Formulas podcast a few years ago, but this is one where counties feel this. This is a program designed for counties with weak income tax bases. The state has a program to sort of reimburse them as long as they're willing to try and raise revenue, right? If they have a tax rate that the state feels is appropriate, the state has a program to help them along. But we see again this program capped for 3 years, big losses to Prince George's County, and stands out to me, Allegheny County. And Michael, this is the county that took a big hit with the Western Maryland floods. We know that FEMA didn't show up. There's been a lot of back and forth, but this one stands out as particularly tough when you're talking about a county that's dealing with what they're dealing with out there.
Yeah, you put it perfectly. I mean, the whole idea of the disparity grant is that multiple times the state has said, well, we know we're making these deep cuts to local governments, and you might need some revenue capacity to offset those cuts so you can stay afloat. Here's some more ability to use income tax locally as a tool to make yourselves whole. And your residents will feel it, but at least you can balance the books for county government, which, I mean, you can debate whether that's good policy, but there also is the weakness. What if we don't have very much income to tax? We can't get much out of that. The disparity grant was supposed to be the solution. If your jurisdiction gets way less bang for the buck than the state average, when you do your income tax, the state will help with a little bit of a match to get you closer to average. And in a year like this year, when the data says that counties like Prince George's and Allegheny are that far, they're even further below the state average, they're supposed to get a bump. And in the name of budgeting, the state's basically saying, we're just going to ignore the formula and cap you at last year's number. I mean, I don't think anyone is out to get Allegheny County or Prince George's County for that matter. It's just a matter of affordability. But you end up with real rough edges in budgeting like this. And we said this. We did our formula. We did that formula-based podcast a couple of years ago. I'll say the same thing again. I hope somebody out there is listening. They should put a smoothing effect on this formula. The disparity grant should not be up and down like a seismograph. You should do it like on a 3-year basis so everybody knows that the ups and downs will be more predictable. It would be better for everybody.
Right. And we should point out also that the the cap, if you will, in dollars placed for counties, the dollars that counties get has been adjusted multiple times. And so I think if you look at like last year's approved budget, tens of millions of dollars that originally were supposed to go to these jurisdictions, the General Assembly has artificially adjusted those caps over the years, again, for budgeting purposes. So the program is even more behind than it should be. And now we have a $27 million hit just for fiscal 27. And again, they cap the disparity grant program for 3 years. So, this is something that people feel. These counties are going to feel this, and we're certainly going to have a lot to say, but not an ideal scenario there. We also see, Michael, community colleges, counties are partners in funding community colleges and have stepped up over the years, because only one time did the state actually meet its funding obligation, and that was a few years ago when we had a lot of federal funds rolling in. The state actually met its obligation for the first time ever in funding community colleges, but since has backslid, and now we see that community colleges get an increase, Michael, sounds great, of $13 million for fiscal 2027. That's an increase of 2.6%. However, the BRFA goes on to cap each community college's growth at 3% for 3 years. So under the uncapped formula, the funding would have grown by 32 million in fiscal 27. That cap reduces the increase by 21 million. So, and you're going to see, again, similar issues in the next 2 years because it's capped at 3% for 3 years. And this shows up for counties because when they don't have the funding they need, typically the only place to go is student tuition or to the county government, and no one wants to raise tuition. So counties, again, have stepped up a lot over the years, and by capping their growth, again, it definitely increases the chances that they're going to have to come to the county governments to make them whole. So again, not an ideal situation there. There is an increase for 27, but not as much as it should have been, and that happens for the next 3 years. So again, Michael, not ideal there for community colleges.
Right. I mean, that summary was spot on, and that's the lay of the land. It's always challenging on a public policy grounds. What do you say and do when you're still getting a bump? Like the overall state budget is basically flat, and community colleges are going to get a 3% bump or thereabouts, 2 or 3% for each of the schools, as opposed to a larger one that they were supposed to have gotten. I mean, they were supposed to be on track to get a full funding through a formula that was debated and reinforced multiple times. So they've got reasonable justifications for being at that full funding. But that said, you cut back to something that's still growth and it'll keep pace from last year. I don't know where that debate resolves, honestly.
Right. And four-year universities also not getting, what they should be getting in terms of full funding, if you will. So again, the entire sector feeling it there. But again, if you look at it just of what it should be versus what it is, it's not ideal. One thing that stands out to me, Michael, and I want to get into this as somebody who's been in the trenches with our 911 folks over the years and trying to get more equitable funding formulas, which we have achieved here in Maryland, and someone who holds very close to my heart the necessity to make sure that 911 fees actually go toward 911. There is language in state law that restricts those funds as only being available for the 24 county 911 centers, as it should be. However, in the BRFA, the BRFA proposes to allow 911 funds to fund the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. Now, I want to be clear that the Maryland Department of Emergency Management needs funding. They are almost exclusively reliant on federal dollars, and we know that is a big issue. We also know that, I mentioned earlier, in Western Maryland, FEMA didn't show up, and increasingly it seems like FEMA is getting out of the disaster recovery business. So there's a lot of gaps there to fill. But to take 911 trust fund dollars, Michael, and divert them away from 911, and after the effort that MACO undertook and all of our 911 specialists and professionals, and they all showed up in Annapolis and talked about the importance of this money being used exclusively for 911, it is disappointing to see a provision like this in the BRFA. And I know that there are going to be people with a lot to say about this one, including senators, delegates, et cetera. So this is a new one, and it's near and dear to our hearts, and certainly understand the need for funding. And when it comes to emergency management, certainly that's something we talk about a lot at the local level, and we're partners with MDEM, but this just doesn't seem like the way to do it.
Yeah, I think I remember back, you were testifying on Mako's behalf on last year's big, broad budget reconciliation bill. And I think you started your oral testimony by saying, we get it. And
Yeah.
I thought that was a good level set. It's like, okay, like a giant, we have to fix the budget. And some of that's going to be a bit unsightly and even unseemly. And so you end up with like, okay, we're cracking some eggs here, man. This is lousy policy. Like you create a trust fund and you tell people like your fee is going into this trust fund. It's just going for the services so we can get the emergency people to you when you need them. And people very much buy into, I will pay a fee on my phone bill so I can
Right.
have that service. Like, like that's a pretty firm handshake deal with the Maryland ratepayer, taxpayer, fee payer. Your
Right.
residents believe in that kind of program. And I know that there's a little bit of a strain to say, well, statewide emergency management is kind of similar too, but man, I don't like unlocking that trust fund box. I don't like it.
No, and you mentioned it, unlocking the box, because if you start going down this road, and again,
Right.
there's a reason why there is language in state law that's very, very explicit about this, and that the money is in, the lockbox. We know the lockbox can be broken, but
Yeah.
again, yeah, let's not break it here and add temptation in future years to divert funds to other things. There's also no language that nothing in the BRFA talks about how much they can take or for how long. It's just a pretty blanket statement that now 911 trust fund dollars can be used to fund MDEM. So again, sympathy to MDEM, we get it, but this is just not the way to do it, especially for our 911 professionals. So yeah.
I hope they can rearrange some pieces here and there and get this one off the table. I mean, it's not exactly. This is about the functioning of our response centers, our public safety answering points back in the counties. So yeah, it's a county government thing, but like this is back to like if this were in its own bill as opposed to part of the budget reconciliation thing, there'd be a line out the door to say, please don't do this.
Yes, absolutely. And Michael, if I could take a moment of personal privilege just to talk about one other issue and generally with the way the state budgets and how they define certain spending and what I want to get into is local aid. And you see this local aid, you hear people talking about it, and there's a big top line item that says local aid increases by $381 million. Now, if I'm just, a member of the public and I'm not paying attention too much and I see local aid, I assume that probably means like my local government, right? The county or the municipality. And even in Annapolis, the way we talk about local government means county and municipality. But the way that the Department of Legislative Services, the way that Annapolis speak does things is that they call local aid again, you would think it's county municipalities, but local aid doesn't mean that at all. In fact, 85% of local aid goes directly to the schools. So while the money passes through county budgets, counties have no say on, how to spend the money, where the money goes, et cetera. It just goes to the schools. So when I hear people talking about, well, even with the cost shifts and, if you look at the counties and you look at this number, $381 million, that they're still making out okay. Things are good for local governments. Local aid is up 381 million.
Yeah.
Newsflash, 97% of that $381 million goes direct to the schools. So my rant is that I don't understand why we don't just call that education funding, call it what it is. And I don't understand why we have to say anything about local in this education funding, right? This is not local aid, this is education funding. And I don't understand why we need to confuse people, especially even senators and delegates who look at that and just say, wow, counties, municipalities are doing fine. I don't know why they're in here complaining about cost shifts because local aid's up 380 million bucks. Why don't we just call it education funding, Michael? Maybe you know better than I do.
I don't know, but I will say, I'll even add to, first of all, that's a great summary and I completely co-sign it. I'll just add one more thing, not even from the perspective of local governments who we are. Okay. So discount our point of view as local government people, but just if you're a delegate and you want to come back home and talk about what did you invest in this year's budget? Why did you raise my taxes last year? Or why did you cut some programs and this and that? What things did you actually support in the state budget? What are my taxes going for? I'd much rather tell people we made a big investment in education, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
a winner with an awful lot of people. And like a lot of senators and delegates would be happy to run by saying, I'm committed to education. And that meant some other things had to go because the kids were first. But instead, you give them all these summary documents. It's like, no, my first priority was aid to local governments. And people are like, what the heck are you talking about? The swing sets are fine. Like the park seemed fine. Like I don't care about my local jail. That's my not my jam. It's like that's a really weird way to send your members home armed with crappy tools to brag about things they prioritize. So part B of the same rant.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. It doesn't make any sense. And again, I'd much rather say that I funded the schools, but for everyone's benefit, local aid does not mean funding for housing programs locally or public safety or transportation, fill in potholes. Local aid means funds for the schools. It is education funding, and they should call it education funding. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that and reads that. But this did come up during the fiscal briefing, so hopefully people understand what that means. But we should just call it education funding and be done with it. And Michael, I want to get into another item here. We've talked a lot about affordability. We opened our pre-session podcast talking about affordability, connecting debates about housing, energy costs. Does this governor's budget get into that territory, Michael?
Right. I think it's an interesting question. I think it's a fair conclusion. Like if you spend your time saying we're really interested in affordability for Marylanders, and that's why we're going to go after housing supply and try and spur more housing, and that's why we're going to go after the energy markets and see if we can subsidize or control or limit increases on your electric bill because we're worried about affordability for Marylanders. I mean, another of that is the sort of bundle of services and things that we supply through the government that we all pay for in taxes. There's the affordability in taxes. Now, I'm not saying this as like an anti-tax rant and that taxation is theft and so forth. I mean, that's a political persuasion. That's not even where I'm trying to go here. But I am saying like the magnitude of some of these things can eventually rack up. I think the real answer to your question is I don't think this year's budget is the reckoning for overall affordability, but we've seen the arithmetic on what things look like for a year from now. And about this time next session, if we're going through a budget reconciliation bill, the state might be sitting and looking at like a $4 billion problem, maybe. I mean, that's conceivable. I don't know how many households are there in Maryland? Something like 2 million, 2.5. I mean, you're getting to the point where you're at, okay, this is like $2,000 a year per household. And how are we going to find the money to pay for all this stuff or to back off on some of the spending to avoid that affordability concern? But I think at a certain level, the overall level of spending and the taxes to support it and the fees and so forth that support it is an element in the affordability debate. I don't think you can sidestep that completely. So I don't think it's a big fight this year. It's not like there are outcomes in this year's budget that really move the needle by billions. But next year, I think it kind of is.
Yeah, and you look at, you just mentioned you're in the billions, and that's not going to come from the wealthiest of the wealthy in Maryland. That's not going to come from the businesses. It's not going to come from the Facebooks of the world, right? That's going to come from the middle class. And it's either going to be income tax or sales tax, and that's really the only way to get the kind of money the state's going to need. So I agree with you, and I think obviously, again, when you look at this budget, it works. But when you look at the out years and you look at the way the governor's budget resolves the deficit, it's temporary, right? And there isn't anything in here that's long term to address the challenges. And really, the only place to go to get the kind of revenue they need, again, is to the average Marylander. So that's a debate for later. Certainly not going to be a debate in an election year, but that is the reality. And I think the point is well taken. What does the future look like? And Michael, look, again, there is some relief in here for ratepayers when it comes to energy. We talk about affordability, but the state is limited in what it can do. But Marylanders are certainly going to be concerned about their rising energy bills. You see it all over the place, and it's got to be frustrating for lawmakers at some point because there's not a whole lot Maryland can do. But that debate is going to play out, and same with housing, right? And there are a lot of aspects that go into it, but certainly we are stakeholders in the housing debate, and we're bringing forward some good ideas, and certainly we understand housing is a big issue, but there are a lot of moving targets here, Michael, and a lot of moving pieces. And I agree with you that affordability is continuing to be a theme, and it will be a theme for the foreseeable future, no doubt, especially with all the chaos in DC and how that could affect our numbers, right? That's a big thing.
I agree with all that, top to bottom.
Right. So I guess, Michael, let's try and wrap this up a bit. I mean, the big picture, I mean, from where you sit and you look at this budget versus budgets in previous years, where do we go from here? Where are we? And what do you think this means as the General Assembly begins its work?
I would say, I mean, there are always going to be a half dozen issues that kind of turn into little minor brush fires, but I don't think we're in for a big wholesale debate about sort of our fiscal posture in this year. It's an election year. There's a lot of folks who are kind of motivated to, okay, like the governor's plan's good enough and he kind of owns it and so forth. So I think the reasonable forecast is this should be a less controversial, less, I don't know, bombastic budget process than last year. So I would anticipate relatively smooth sailing with the one, like if you're looking for fun, oof, what a weird word. If you're looking for a twist, I guess it would be every year we schedule the Board of Revenue Estimates revises the official number we balance to for what we really think is going to come in with income tax and sales tax and the lottery and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes that is a non-event that they make an adjustment and it's only 10 or 20 million to the good or bad, which is virtually nothing. But some years that's really good news or really bad news. If that plays out as bad news, like if that's 250 million worse, then suddenly some combination of the governor needs to send down a supplemental budget that makes some changes, and or the legislature just needs to cut more deeply into the governor's proposal. That could be where like folks like us find, wait, another layer onto counties or hospitals or other stakeholders, state agencies, state employees. Oh, you lose your cost of living adjustment, or we're gonna make you pay more toward your health insurance. Like the list of things that could happen if things get a meaningful click or two worse could be tricky. That seems like the biggest pivot ahead is early March. Bad news could make relatively calm seas a little choppy again. Sound about right to you?
I think so, right? And I do think that with all the uncertainty that and the effect that federal policy has had on our workforce and just on our economy generally, certainly that is a concern. I mean, I know that DLS also flagged some other potential issues. I think a lot of the Child Victims Act, which is something that has come up. There's 12,000 claims apparently under the Child Victims Act as of June 1st, 2025, and the state has a big liability there. There's no funding source for this, so there's a ton of exposure in the out years that really hasn't gone away. The department also flagged an issue with transportation dollars and some dollars that were maybe flagged as federally reimbursable and maybe that they're not, that's a potential issue. So, I mean, and those are real dollars, right? And so there's not a plan for these things. These are on top of the issues that we already have, but those are kind of lingering big ticket items that kind of stand out in what DLS says are potential issues moving forward. Of course, with added to all the uncertainty with the federal government and how it affects our workforce and economy. But those are just a couple other odds and ends in terms of what could go bad and costs that could come due. And there's really not a plan to deal with them. Most of this likely sticks, right? I mean, when we talk about the cost shifts, and obviously, again, we're going to have a lot to say about that and what that means for the services counties provide every single day. And every dollar that they shift onto counties is another dollar that we have to take away from something else. We have to balance our budgets. It's not like we can just spend money. So I think that the easiest path here is that this stuff, most of it at least sticks. But again, based off of what happened last year and then in this proposed budget, that's about $200 million. So again, not unexpected in terms of what the state is dealing with, and that counties were going to have to absorb some of that. But again, not ideal, and some of this stuff I know we're going to have a lot to say. So again,
Yep.
that's where we are. We're looking at about a $200 million number in terms of helping the state to balance the state's books. And that's before, Michael, of course, any of the legislation that's already out there and what that could mean. And we're at the table each and every day. So I think that's a pretty good summation of where we are. Anything to add to close us out?
I think that's about it. I mean, it's an election year. Ordinarily, fiscal stuff is not what you want in the headlines during an election year. So I wouldn't expect a whole lot of, like high profile. Well, what about this $500 million plan or that $500 million plan? This should be this governor's budget plan should come out of the legislative process looking awfully similar, and for good reason. Like they did most of the predictable, straightforward kind of stuff. So I don't think it's outrageous. We'll have our quarrels. Some other stakeholders will too, but expect a lot of this to look the same, I think, come April.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it for today. Obviously, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, you should be reading the Conduit Street blog. Each and every day, every bill Mako testifies on gets a blog item, so you can keep track of everything that we're doing and all the bills Mako weighs in on. Great resource, but we'll leave it there for today. For Michael Sanderson and our wonderful producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.